All right, last week we began looking at the main body of the text of Colossians with verses 8 through 10, where that is the Apostle Paul, begins to bring up the specific problem that they did. So as what's typical, Paul is going to have an introduction. This one was longer, dealing with the situation and the personal situation, which because he didn't know them made sense. And then he typically is going to have something that addresses the problem, the issue, or the doctrines that are associated with that. Before then, he moves over and then has practical kind of applications of what this should mean then positively for you. And so now he introduced last week these issues, which we looked at all around the problem of this philosophy that we noted has a Jewish origin, is wrapped around Judaism, and that would take them away, he said, from Christ. And that's why he had addressed so much about the nature of Christ, is to get them back and saying that they're in denial of the fact that you have the Messiah who is God, who came and was in the flesh or in a body, human body. And so we ended looking at verse 10, that where he's now also talking about how you are complete in him. And this is key at the end, who is the head of all principality and power. That last line is going to be important. It showed up in chapter 1. He's now coming back to it in chapter 2. I think it's actually going to make more sense when we get to it here in chapter 2 a little bit further on. So the whole idea is that Jesus is always enough. And that tells you what they were being told, is that there was more that they needed to learn beyond what Jesus and the gospel had to offer. And the examples that are going to be given are coming up. He's going to have a list of everything they were being told, and this statement that, no, you're complete, you're good. Okay, and so now he's going to take that, and we're going to see how, beginning in verse 11, the center of it is Jewish, and how how Jesus addressed all this and that they did when they become Christians. And then he's going to get in, that's verses 11 through 15. And then in verses 16 through the remainder of the chapter, he's going to start mentioning and showing the problems of don't be paying attention to all these kind of ideas they keep throwing out there. Okay, that's the rest of the chapter. So we begin, he says in verse 11, in him you were also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. Okay. Now, that statement is important. He's not done with his sentence, and that's very important that he's not done. But it tells you, because he mentions circumcision 3 times, circumcised, circumcision, circumcision, that was a big Jewish issue, and it was what defined you. So what was the key about circumcision for a Jew? What does that go back to? Okay, law of Moses, all the way to Abraham. Okay, so now when you understand, what did it mean though when Abraham was given that? Do you recall? Good. It was the sign of the acceptance of the covenant. Okay. So, and that's what also was part of it under the law, and within the Jewish framework, it became this symbol, if you would, of that we are different. We're gods. Okay. So circumcision, they had the idea of circumcision, the temple, and the law were big. Okay. This is what made Jews, and we're different, and made us God's people. Those were kind of the key elements of how they had kind of distilled it by the first century. So with that background, here's what's saying you're under the covenant. That's key to appreciate and understanding what he is saying here. Because when he says in him, now that's Jesus, you were also, circle that or underline it, you were also circumcised. Okay. But it's different. With the circumcision made without hands. Okay. So you were circumcised, but you weren't circumcised. Now remember that these people in Colossae were mainly not, clearly, they were not Jews. They've been taught the gospel, but most of them were not Jews at all, and that becomes part of the problem, and that they are being told that they need to be circumcised, among other things. Okay, so you still have a little bit of that Judaizing element to it, but that's not the focus of it. It's broader about all things Jewish. Okay, so he comes back and he says, wait a minute, you've already done this. In that, you've already received a type of circumcision. They're trying to push on you to be under the covenant and therefore belong to God. If you're going to be God's, you've got to be circumcised. And he says, you've already been circumcised. I'm sure the men were thinking, I think I would have remembered that. What do you mean by this? Okay. It was made without hands. Now he's going to describe it. By putting off the body of the sins of the flesh. And depending upon your translation, you'll have of the sins won't be there. Okay, that's just, it's missing in certain manuscripts. And depending upon which manuscripts the translators valued, that's how it determines if it ends up in your Bible or not. Okay, doesn't make a huge difference here in the meaning of the text. I think it's more precise. But the whole idea is by putting off. Now, I also want you to note that word. We're going to come back to that idea of putting off, okay, later on if we get there. But you divested yourself. You got rid of this, okay? So what are you getting rid of? The body of the flesh. Now, you're not getting rid of this body. He's talking about something that's already been done. You were circumcised. So the body of the flesh, or the body of the sins of the flesh. You got rid of some part of you, though. And there's an interesting play that's going on here when you consider with the body what he said in verse 9 about Jesus. About in him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. He's now saying there's part of you that you got rid of. And that's why the sins comes in if your Bible has that in there. Is that he's talking about getting rid of those things that identified you spiritually with sin, with your being against God, and that you were opposed to God. That's what you got rid of, okay? How did you get rid of those? What was the means? By the circumcision of Christ. So there was something that he's calling the circumcision of Christ that was not a circumcision literally because it was made without hands. Now, this isn't hard because we can continue the sentence to verse 12. But I want you to have thought about, here's what we have. We have something that symbolizes and recognizes covenant that makes you part of God's people, that is a circumcision figuratively but not literally, because it's not made with hands, okay? In the same way that is a circumcision made with hands. Now people go back to this and they say, well, it's totally spiritual. It says, no, you're missing the point. But let's read verse 12 now. When did this happen? What is this? Buried with him in baptism, in which you also were raised with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. Now that's the end of the sentence. So he has identified for us the circumcision of Christ. And when you get to it, it says that you are buried, okay? That is a modal participle, which is, it's explaining what he just said. Being buried with him. So when it says that you're buried, the circumcision of Christ, being buried with him in baptism. So that's where he's talking about why did he say buried then? Because he just said you put off the body of the flesh. Something died. And it needed to be buried. But we're not talking about something that is literal and physical in the way circumcision was, but something else that makes you God's people in keeping, and that you're accepting the covenant. That's baptism. And so when he says then, buried with him in baptism, of course that word is, I always say, what great Greek word do we have for this? Baptisma. They didn't bother to translate it. Why did they not translate it? Why do we have that? Well, because when it originally went, they weren't actually immersing, and that would have been embarrassing to stick that in the text everywhere when that's not what they were practicing at the time. But that's what it means. So you are buried. Okay? I always thought that was, they really didn't think this through, right? You're buried by being something sprinkled on you. No. Poured on you. No. You're buried in an immersion. And when he says this, you're buried with him. Okay? Who's the him? Jesus. That's who he's been talking about, because there was a circumcision of Christ. He's the one that did it. In him you were also circumcised. And it was the circumcision of Christ because of that. That's why, how did that happen? You were buried with him. Again, not literally, but you were tying yourself to him when you accepted being buried in baptism. It's Jesus that convinced you to do this, and you tied yourself to him. That meaning, when it says there, buried, it's soon. It means together with. And you say buried. And think about that just as for a moment, buried with. It's saying you, in that sense, you went and entered the same tomb. So in baptism, symbolically, you're entering Jesus' tomb. You're tying yourself to him. And what happened? Why? Because you also put off your body. That had to go. Which is, Jesus died. He's in the tomb. You're tying yourself to him in his death, to him in his burial. And then he says, in which, that's in the baptism, by means of that baptism, you also were raised with him. So now we've got the next part. So notice what we have here. We have death, burial, resurrection of Jesus, and we're tying ourselves to that by dying to our old life that's in the flesh and tied to sin, being buried by being baptized, and then coming up out of the water, and in doing that, he says, guess what? You were raised with him, but here's what happened in doing that. Now, we're coming on to the last part, which is you're resurrected. That means new life. So that's implied. You were raised with him. But here's how. Through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. And I think that last part is really important too. Through faith. That is, what you believe when you are being baptized matters. Otherwise, we could just go around, grab people, dunk them under water, and they're good. Right? Did that to kids at camp all the time. No problem. But that was not the point. Okay? So what is? You have to believe in what God is accomplishing. What does God say he's doing at that point? That's the working of God. It can't be, I believe something. It's got to believe what God wants you to believe about what he's doing in that process. So your faith needs to be in the reason why, that is a response to what God has said, he's going to do. So if you don't have that kind of faith, then he can't do that without you kind of saying, that's why I'm doing it. Why? It's covenant. So if you're not going in to be baptized in order to enter a covenant because you're dying to your sins and you are buried with him and you want a new life because you think you already have one, well, that faith is not in what God says he'll do. You have to have your faith be right, but it has to be faith too. Okay, what do I mean by that? It cannot just simply be going through the motions, this is what we do, going and being baptized, and the baptism is magical. That's the flip side of all this. And I think some people think that we teach that. Okay, it's not magic water. Notice what he is talking about here is you are choosing to accept passively, which is the same way Jesus did it. He accepted passively death. He was buried, passive. He was raised, passive. It's an acceptance of what God is capable of doing. So in baptism, you are submitting to something. You're not, in that sense, doing something. You're having to do something, but you're submitting to something in terms of God's will in the covenant. It's about your will accepting God's will. That's actually the key element in all this. And that's why you go back to Jesus in the garden praying, not my will, but thy will be done. So now we tie this together. You're raised with him through faith. You have to have your faith right, fully trusting that it's God who's doing something. You are not forgiving yourself or forcing God into something. It is understanding what he has offered, what he has promised, and it's something he does. How do you know when you are baptized? When you come up out of the water, how do you know that you're forgiven? Well, I know. Well, I know, but how do you know that? You were taught. Why were you taught that? Because God says that, people. That's Acts 2:38. That's Acts 22, verse 16. Okay? That's Mark 16:16. Okay. That's why you know it happens. But you know it by faith. It's a matter of you trust that God will do what God said he would do when you do what he tells you to do. It's completely faith, because if you don't have that trust that he'll do that, you don't have faith going into it. But the working is what God does. Through faith in the working of God. That the word just means activity of God. Okay, the idea of this particular word, it's a strong idea. It's where we get our word energy from. Okay, is the idea that working of God, that he's what's doing something. And it's, again, this is not magical, but it is spiritual in that we've done something that's submitting to his will. And at that moment, he does something spiritual so that we are now under his covenant, his child, forgiven of our sins and holy. Because there was something special about the water? No. Because, wow, aren't we something? Look what we accomplished? No. It's what God can accomplish when we will simply seek his will and do it and follow him and respond to him. And the tie here is, notice, without Jesus, none of that works. To tie it in with Eddie's lesson at the 9 o'clock hour, is that without Jesus, none of that's good. So if our faith is not firmly in what Jesus accomplished, notice how he tied that. If we don't have faith in who Jesus is, which is what he talked about in verse 9, that is God in bodily form who came, okay, that he was the one who was killed, dead, buried, and raised from the dead, and that the Father took him and did that, that's the basis upon what we tie ourselves to in modeling ourselves. God was the one who put those things together and tied them together so that we are tied to Jesus. Galatians chapter 3, 26 and 27. Romans chapter 6, 1 through 4. The same thing is in both those passages too. Stated a little bit differently, but all the principles are still there. So God's the one who's doing something. We are submitting to something so God can do something. Who raised him from the dead. Says, well, I don't see, this is what people say, well, I don't see how baptism can do that. It's not baptism itself. It's God doing something. And if God could raise Jesus from the dead, exactly what do you think he can't do? You saying that he can't forgive your sins? This is important. Go in with that kind of faith of understanding that here is a God who raised Jesus from the dead. And if he can do that, I don't care what you've ever done. I don't care about your past. I don't care if you killed somebody. God can forgive you. Okay? So, he raised him from the dead. That's the power you have operating. He's tying those things together. Okay. Now, let's move on to verse 13. Because he's tying now, going back to being dead. He hadn't actually said that in so many words, but now he comes back to it in verse 13. And you, being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh. So now he's talking about a previous situation. This ought to remind you a little bit of Ephesians 2, 1 through 10. And again, there you don't have all of this there in Ephesians 2. You do have the part about the change from being dead to living, and that it was God's love, grace, and mercy that were essential for that to even be possible. Right? So, that's key. But here's the situation, especially for the Colossians now. You were dead in your trespasses. Okay. What's the difference between a trespass and a sin? It's a perspective matter. It's this sin is that you miss the mark, right? It's the martia, all primitive, you miss the mark. Whereas a trespass, this word is you fall, essentially you fell on the wrong side of things. Okay? And a transgression is you definitely went on the wrong side. It's just a different underlying verb. You fell on the wrong side. So it's the same idea. So you have the idea of your transgressions. Okay, now, so there's a spiritual problem that's important. They didn't know that. No, remember this. Had they heard the gospel before Epaphras went in there? Did they know anything about it, to our knowledge? No. But they still had sinned. They still had a sin problem. This is important to understand, that the problem is not that people haven't heard the gospel, which makes them lost. It's they're lost, which is why they need to hear the gospel. Okay? They were already in this situation. The gospel is going in to correct that situation. You're in trespasses. Your sin, what is it? You're on the wrong side of where you need to be spiritually. You've fallen on the wrong side. Now the second part is also interesting, and the uncircumcision of your flesh. Now what is that referring to? Oh, no. Okay. Is it not you didn't obey the gospel, but he's talking about where they used to be. They hadn't been, but they didn't have an opportunity because they didn't know. Tie this to the context of these Jewish teachers. Yes, before you had a sin problem, a trespass problem, and you did not have the advantage of being in a covenant relationship with God because you weren't Jews. The uncircumcision of your flesh. You were Gentiles. So you didn't have that. Okay, so in the past, you had a sin problem and you had no covenant. That the Jews had. You didn't have either of those. That's right. But, okay, this just shows you where he's going with this. He has made alive, and this is the and you, he has made alive together with him. Now, in the same way that you were made alive together with him is tied in that you were buried together with him. And actually, what's the same preposition is at the beginning of both of those words. Buried together, made alive together. So his point is here, you were dead. And you were dead because you were in sin, you had no covenant relationship with God. But you've been made alive. Now he's tying this to what he just said. Because you've been raised from the dead. So since you're raised from the dead, that means you've been made alive. So we know it was tied to their baptism. He is made alive together with him. Notice again, with Christ. It's that connection to Christ that makes this work. What does that mean that you're made alive? What was tied with it? That's the last part. Having forgiven you all trespasses. All trespasses. When you go back in chapter 1, if you remember, verse 14, in whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. So what he's just done is tied together. At first, he was showing, here's what's possible because Jesus died on the cross, gave his blood, forgiveness is possible. You tied yourself to what he did, which is what makes your forgiveness actual. It is potentially available because of what Jesus did. It becomes actual when you submit to God's will and tying yourself to Jesus and what he did by, in faith, obeying the gospel and being baptized. Verse 14. He's continuing now. This is still same sentence. So he's having forgiven you all trespasses, and this is something else that's happened. So all of this is going back to being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh. He has made alive together with him. That's the main idea, and now here are the things that went with it. Okay, so here's what was accomplished for you and by Jesus. Having forgiven you all trespasses. Now, who has done this? Who raised him from the dead? So this is what God is doing through our attachment to Christ. Having wiped out the handwriting of requirements, it's going to say two things about it. That was against us, which was contrary to us. Okay? What is the handwriting of requirements? There are two basic ideas that people put forward about this. One is that it was the idea of a debt that was written out that you owed. And so he's canceling the debt. The other is that it is the old law. Okay? I think the key, the handwriting could go either way. The word handwriting, I think, could work either way. But when he says this about the decrees, that word is the dogmas. Okay? So that is the precepts. You don't have that kind of thing tied to a debt cancellation. So that I would say that for me pretty much solidifies the case that he's talking about that old law. Why does that matter? Because of the people that he's having problems with. He's telling them what else was accomplished. First, he's telling them what was accomplished for you. But now there's something else that happened. You were forgiven because Jesus died on the cross. But something else happened too. Having wiped out, so this is something some of your translations might say canceled, but wiped out is very good because they would take it as kind of a blotter on their page and just do this. Wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us. Well, how is it against them? If it's the old law, how is that working against them? Well, Jesus did. Yeah, the problem was it could point out your sin, and this is Galatians goes into this in verses 18 through 25. It could point out your sin. It was the standard. It worked as a standard of what God expected. But it didn't actually have a full answer, which is noted in, well, you had sacrifices, yes, but then you go back to Hebrews 10 and verse 4 and say that the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sin. So it was not a complete answer. So it couldn't accomplish what the atonement, the propitiation that was actually required. Okay? It couldn't live up to that. So it could point out the problem without providing the needed solution. So it was, in that way, it operated against us. Okay? But then it adds, and was contrary to us. That's an interesting kind of wording. Is he just saying the same thing twice? These are actually separated. It actually says wiping out that which is against us. The handwriting of the decrees, which was contrary to us, is kind of the original wording. I wonder, and I'm not the only one to suggest this, if that has as much a consequence of this situation between Jews and Gentiles. That is, it worked against us spiritually, but it also created a divide socially, contrary to us. Because of the nature of the word contrary, it's not a slam dunk by any means in terms of interpretation, but that what you have going on is that, think about what this law couldn't do. It couldn't give you the actual deliver on a sacrifice that could solve all this problem. And at the same time, it created some other issues, which is in evidence between just socially, race, Jew and Gentile. But what did he do with this? And he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. I don't know that it's universal, the phrase taken out of the way. Literally, it's taken up out of the midst, which I always wondered why they didn't translate it that way. It's lifting it up out of the middle. So if there's something that was a dividing point, this is more specific in Ephesians 2, verses 14 through 16, in talking specifically about the divide between Jew and Gentile. It mentions there the middle wall of partition. I don't know if that's being alluded to here with the middle, the midst or not. But it has the idea of this problem that was created by this handwriting of decrees. He's lifting it up so it can no longer be the issue in nailing it to the cross. Now, I think the difference is when we say that, I want us to put two things together here about what happened there, because it's very clear in Ephesians. It says that was, and depending on, you might want to check your translation on this, because there can be confusion because of it. It says it's abolished, right? It was abolished. In Matthew 5:17, depending upon your translation there, you might check that one. It says, Jesus said, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law and the prophets." Your translation might read abolish there. Those are two different words. Not come to destroy, but to fulfill. This is key. Jesus took the old law out of the way when he went to the cross, because in doing so, it fulfilled everything that the old law pointed to. In other words, it was not an antagonistic takedown of the law. It was a positive fulfillment of the law that brought the law to its logical spiritual end at the cross. That perspective is going to be important because of other doctrinal ideas that are around there. I think people don't appreciate what it is. It's now at that point with Jesus, everything about the old law was fulfilled and became irrelevant and outdated. Not because it doesn't have any still value. We need to know that. You can't understand the New Testament without studying the Old Testament. You can't do it. It's important to know all those. Think about how many times there are references to God's promises, what the prophet said in the New Testament. So, but that means that law ceases operation as a covenant between man and God. Because Jesus was providing something better. He nailed it to the cross. Now let's look at verse 15. Are y'all impressed with my pace today? Yeah. Me too. Okay, I know. I got all of them back there. Having disarmed principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. You remember earlier in the class when I mentioned that first part about putting off the body of the sins of the flesh? That word putting off is the same word that's being used here, disarmed. It's the context that determines what you're letting go of. It is used for clothing. Okay? It's basically something that is on you that you are putting off you. Or in this case, what Jesus was putting off them. So when it says having disarmed, I think that's a good translation. But it says that they had stuff, that he, and this is, again, tying it together with when did he do this? The cross. And not just the cross, but remember the context already has his resurrection as part of this. So he has disarmed principalities and powers. And that means we have to figure out, what is he talking about here? He's mentioned that going back to chapter 1, okay, in terms of creation. He mentioned it again in verse 10 when he said, and you are complete in him who is the head of all principality and power. He's anticipating what he's going to do, and he's now explaining how that happened, that he's the head. He is the head of all principalities and power because he went to the cross and was raised from the dead. That's what made, so that's very specific in terms of what he did at that moment. Now, when you put this in context, and I actually think this is harder, or can be harder, because you have the questions that people often bring up about principality power. What did it prove? We talk about angelic powers, spiritual powers. That's a very popular view here lately. But contextually, and especially the wording of it, okay, there's a particular cultural wording that he's using here that I think is important. When he says, he made a public spectacle, that's the first part. Technically it is, he made a demonstration in boldness or in open, the idea of that's why it's public, open display. So he didn't do this in quiet, it was in public and a big deal. And then triumphing over them in it. I want to wait to talk about that wording. Okay. What Jesus accomplished when he was raised from the dead proved that he was greater than all those who sent him to the cross. If this is the wording of war, in a way. And it's governmental wording, and I'll show you in just a second. Okay? That's why I think they recognize that and translate it as disarmed. Is that the things that held him previously, and if you want to, I don't know that we can be this specific about it, but go back to the trial for just a moment of Jesus. The trial of Jesus is noted from its back and forth between all these government officials, right? You end up with, well, we're going to this, we got to go first of all to the high priest the Jews recognized, then you got to go to the high priest that the Romans recognized, right? Okay, then, well, you need to go over here, and we go to here. No, now we need to go over here to Pilate. And you got all this going on? And they're all dealing with their own problems. And that is what is mentioned in Psalm 2. So if you go to Psalm 2, which is quoted regularly in the New Testament, why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens, the Lord shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision. Then he shall speak to them and distress them in his deep displeasure. Yet I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree. The Lord has said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. And he continues to go on. But it's about this, it's this struggle between men taking up authority and being important in all, and rather than God. And in that way, as a motif, it at least goes all the way back to Israel saying, make us a king like the nations around us. They didn't want God as their king. And what do you have now? Jesus is king. The Messiah is king. This is a description of what has happened with the resurrection of, okay, now what are you going to do? You killed me. What else you got? Right? He made a public spectacle of them. You're not as powerful as you think. The last phrase won't take long to describe, triumphing over them in it. We think of triumph in just general. The triumph of this particular word, triumbuo, is a Greek term that's referring to what was especially a Roman practice of when a Roman general, but especially later on, a Caesar, would have a victory over somebody, and they would take the people who had been made captive, put them in cages, and parade them. It was a huge parade through the city. And the last one coming through is Caesar. So it's presenting Jesus as all these who worked so hard to try to be victorious over God and his Messiah. He has turned the tables on them, and he is completely dominant, preeminent, and powerful. And that would have included all these Jewish leaders to whom these people would have been appealing. And that's why the transition next is going to be important. We'll pick up there next week, verse 16.